Good afternoon, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Nivanne MORTAGY, and I'm the Regional Industry Head of Operations for IFC's Financial Institutions Group in Africa. It's an honor and a pleasure to moderate this panel on a unifying banking authority. Is Africa ready? That's the question we're going to tackle today. To speak on this important topic, I'll be joined on stage by a very distinguished set of panelists. We have with us the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Zambia, the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Mauritania, the Deputy Managing Director of Société Générale in Côte d'Ivoire, and the Managing Director at Vista Bank in Guinea. First of all, I'd like to welcome on stage our expert presenter, Mr. Aristide the partner advisory at Deloitte Afrique, to set the scene for our discussions. Aristide, welcome.
So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to introduce this very important topic. For your record, the idea to have this discussion comes from a panel that we had last year in AFIS regarding the convergence toward Basel III. And one of the questions was to be sure that Africa has one voice when they talk about the regulation. So I will start by presenting you some facts. Africa has a very fragmented banking regulatory landscape with few common supervisory bodies. We have counted at least 41 banks, central banks across Africa, and even we have the Association of African Central Banks. We have only two real supervisory body in Western Africa, BCAO, and GOEH-AKUE in Central Africa. So it's really difficult to have an industry talking on the same with the same word, and also have harmonization of this regulation. And they have some great ideas, some great projects, but not yet implemented. We have, for example, the Community of African Banking Supervisor. So it's a body of the Association of African Central Banks. But this community is not yet sufficiently operational. You have the so-called African Central Bank project. So this is an African Union project linked to the African Monetary Institute. And they have some studies and some task force that are working on that. The initial calendar agenda and deadline was to create this central bank in 2022. We are in 2023, so we are out of delay. We also have interesting initiatives such as recently the East African Financial Services Commission that want to create a kind of sub-regional supervision body. But all of these initiatives need to be accelerated. So I think in this reflection, it's important to leverage on what can be the good practices across the world. And we have a very interesting benchmark, which is the European Banking Authority. And it's a specialized agency of the European Union aiming to harmonize the banking regulation across Europe. As you see, it's a European Union level, so you have different currencies. So it's not a question of currency, but it's a question of a political body with a specialized agency dealing with all the questions regarding regulation. So it's the heart of the European Banking Authority is the single rule book. I will explain that later. And this is the body that talks about the harmonization of regulation, the protection of customers, and also sometimes it's intervene for mediation between supervisors, between the public authorities and the banking authority, and also they ensure the correct application of the different regulations. So this is a very powerful tool, and with a very straightforward organization. So you have a board of supervisors, you have a resolution committee, and also working group and what they call standing committees that are experts that are working on different topics. Okay, and the deliverable of EBA are various. The first one is guidelines and recommendation. Okay, so this is work from experts, from task force that propose guidelines and recommendation. And after that, they propose technical standards. With two types of technical standards, you have binding technical standards. So that comes to regulation. So regulation are binding and they apply to all the European countries. So that will ease the harmonization. And you also have directives. So the directives that allows the country to have some national discretions. Okay? They also provide some opinions and also different reports regarding to the level of adoption of the different regulation. So a very straightforward organization that I think can be implemented in Africa. And one of, as I said, the single rule book is really the heart of the organization of the European Banking Authority. During the different speeches, we have talked about the lack of harmonization on some specific topics: solvency, payment services, capital markets, financial stability, and other regulation. And this is how the European Banking Authority has organized also the way they create this single rule book. For solvency, for example, you have to know that Europe doesn't apply 100% Basel III. They apply the capital requirement regulation. So this is a binding part of the regulation, and they apply the capital requirement directive for the national discretions. Okay, it's the same for the so-called PSD2, so the Payment Service Directive, that has been an accelerator of the development of fintech in Europe, since they have a unified one rule for the payment services, and also you have the directive of electronic money. So if we want to have one common commercial space, for example, if I take the example of payment service, it's really easy in Europe because you have one single directive. You have the same for the capital markets, the EMIR regulation, with one single rule for capital markets. For AML, also financial securities, is exactly the same approach. So, to finish, a Pan-African Banking Authority is time for Africa to be innovative and pragmatic. There is three main pillars if we want that to succeed. The first one is a strong political endorsement. This is an African Union level framework. As I said, European Banking Authority is an agency of the European Union. So this is really important to have this strong political endorsement, and I was really happy that the head of state of Togo put that on the agenda of the African Union. The second is to leverage on existing framework, so I talk about that, the ASCB, the African Central Bank Project, the Community of African Banking Supervisor, and so on. And to finish, a pragmatic and realistic approach. You can take leverage on what I present earlier, the organization of the European Banking Union. So, is Africa ready for that? I hope that our great speakers will cover this subject. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Aristide, for this excellent presentation. Now I'd like to welcome on our stage our distinguished panelists. Gentlemen. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for spending the afternoon with us. We're very much looking forward to having this discussion, and I'm sure that by the end of this panel, we'll have definitely a perspective that we'll be able to share with the audience, and perhaps a way to look at the question at hand. So first, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Zambia, Dr. Francis CHIPIMO, the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Mauritania, Mr. Boumedienne TAYA, Mr. Marc, Deputy Managing Director at Société, Générale in Côte d'Ivoire, and Mr. Martial GOEH, Managing Director at Vista Bank. And Martial, I know you told me how to pronounce your name. I hope I did it justice. Thank you. So, with that excellent introduction from Aristide, let's jump straight to the question at hand. The first point of discussion that we're going to speak about is what is the best approach towards harmonization, and what would central banks actually be prepared to work with a supranational body? So let's start for the first question for you, sir.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en français.
Thank you. I'm going to express myself in French. The question is, do we need a single regulator for the African banking system? As Aristide said, I've done 41 years of central banking. I've been a regulator for the Central Bank of West Africa and also for Central Africa. Today, all regulators speak the same language because they are based on bar, and they set down the rules about liquidity, transparency. I think all major banks and central banks today, work under regulators, and they try to obey the rules. Now, should we have a single regulator for managing prudential ratios, standards? Well, and with regard to sanctions, and we have to be looking at protecting depositors. Should we go as far as that? Because we should be looking at it, but among colleague regulators, this is done already, but we have to have in Africa a supranational organ that can align itself and ensure that those who are already major banks move towards this practice gradually. Thank you.
You represent a bank, a financial services group with operations in 18 different countries. Do you believe there's a need for financial regulatory harmonization in Africa?
Merci pour la question.
Thanks for the question. Good day, everyone. I'm going to express myself in French as well. I think we should bear one thing in mind, that is harmonization of banking, because it favors economic integration and facilitates trade at international within the community. And the question today is, how do we harmonize? Should it be under only one regulator or another scenario to be studied. But personally, I think that this harmonization is necessary because everyone is agreed on that. With regard to the approach has to be gradual, as far as I can see, because today we have various, well, we have only 2 among all the 40 ones that were mentioned. Others are diverse. They don't follow the same monetary or economic policies. That is why I say that we should go it gradually. The first thing to do is to have at regional level certain regulators, and from that point it could be assumed that good practices, best practices, and coordination will be harmonized. And a single regulator, to me, today is rather utopic. So what I see is that we should have regulators within each country that are going to be working together, and we should have like a controller, but this controller should be independent, and his independence should be guaranteed at supranational national level, and he should be equipped to look into the practicality of what has been decided.
Private sector players, I think it's time that we would ask the regulators. So DG CHIPIMO, your job necessarily isn't to make financial services provision as easy as possible, but to ensure actually the stability of the Zambian financial sector. Would you believe that this approach would support a regulatory harmonization in Africa?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and also to Aristide for his comments. I think I fully subscribe to the way he laid out the African landscape. He finished with a very provocative question, which was, can we afford to have one? I think I would flip it and say the real issue is, can we afford not to have one? And I started from the perspective that, all the stuff we're going to be discussing here, ultimately, for us, it comes down to growth, because that's what we need to do to create jobs, employment, and then meet the big risks which we have. And finance is going to have to play a very big role in that process. And when you think about that role of finance, whether it's intermediating funds, or, transmitting payments, or, pricing of market instruments, or even redistributing risk. If that's going to work well, the regulator has to be there. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective. And so, on your first point, for me, the regulator has a very important role in making sure that finance can meet the needs of the private sector. And then you can sort of build from that. If you look at the African landscape and the way the supervisory frameworks have developed, you can sort of look at it from 2 points. I think at one level you could look at Aristide's conclusion and be a bit dispirited. But if you sort of scratch the surface, there's a lot which is happening. And it's happening at sort of 2 levels, which we hope are converging. At the AU level, he mentioned the Association of African Central Bankers, who are essentially now, I think, taking forward the African Monetary Cooperation Program. That covers not just conversion on the monetary side, but also payment system, cross-border collaboration, but also issues around the regulators themselves of the institutions. And so they've got sub-units which look at that. Zambia this year, in fact, took over the chairmanship of that, and my governor is the chair of that now. So the next stage, I think, is to look at the instruments for the African Monetary Institute, and hopefully those can be passed. But the other level, which he also mentioned, which is important, is at the regional level. And this is where I subscribe to what was said about these things have to be gradual. When we look at these rules and regulations, we have to think about proportionality as well, because the countries are different. But there is a lot of collaboration already going on. We see it in our own SADC region. The supervisors meet, we have the colleges, and they're getting better at it. And we're also collaborating with the EU and other financial institutions like the World Bank and so on. So I think there's a lot going on. We certainly need, I think, a body which coordinates us. And there are two areas where probably I will, and to end my points, which are important. One, I think, is sort of standardizing information, and the other, obviously, is standardizing the rules and the regulations. And I think we are making headway along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Governor. So, Deputy Governor TAYA, tell me, would Mauritania be prepared to work with a supernatural body on financial regulation?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel to express my opinion. Thank you for the presentation. Well, with regard to Mauritania, I think it was stated, we think there should be a global approach, gradually, and then we move gradually towards harmonizing banking and supervisory rules. We are ready to work with a supranational organization, but this is the very long-term objective. So we have to go it gradually. I think a regional approach would be a good idea, because each region has its particular features. So it's therefore, advisable to start with a regional approach and move to the supranational level. But then the minimum of rules that could be put in place by every country, every region, with a supervisory basis, and take it from there. Because for now, we are of the opinion that harmonization has become necessary within the continent. We require this regulation to be able to make the contributions required for our people. Thank you.
The discussion point that we're going to move to is from IFRS to AML. Which standards and regulations are crying out to be harmonized? And we'd like first to start with Dr. Francis on this one. So financial regulations span everything from accounting and reporting standards to anti-money laundering legislation. If we were to start harmonizing financial regulation across the continent, where do you think we should start?
Thank you very much. Again, I guess to sort of follow on from my earlier comments, I know African countries are really at different stages in terms of implementing the various international standards. So whether this is the Basel IFRS and other AML CFT institutions. But we do have a base to build on. I think all of us have regional bodies which are looking at AML CFT, for example. I know Central Africa has one. In the Eastern and Southern African region, we have one as well. And these are all pushing us and helping us to adopt FATF standards, and also the framework of self-regulation is also important as well. So, certainly in all the two issues you raised, IFRS 9, I think we're adopting international standards there, as well as in the AML CFT. These are things for which we have a collaborative framework, specifically at the regional level, which is working on that. I think the issue there is what Aristide raised, which is, since these regulations are typically promulgated in the advanced economies, how can we better organize ourselves to be able to make them contextual to us? because once you go foul of these, you can lose corresponding banking relationships, for example, and that becomes a very challenging thing, as we've seen in some areas. So I think that is an area of greater cooperation which we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll turn to you next. So Vista Bank has operations in Guinea, Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Burkina Faso. Can you give us an example from your experience on how the harmonization of regulation would be beneficial to your group?
Alors, Vista Bank est un groupe panafricain. Nous sommes
Well, it's a Pan-African group that is in several countries. We are going to be in more. Today, we have a governance that is strong. It's an international one. It's a big bank. We had the first one in Guinea. We had one of the first in Burkina Faso. And within our banks, we have very strict governance rules. All our banks comply to the rules in their country, and then we've gone further because the issue of a single regulator is not only a question for central banks. We also apply this to primary banks, because if you do not follow these regulations, you can't make any progress. You cannot have a bank that only obeys regulations that are stipulated in your country. So we are in the process of strengthening our governance and so on. Now, AML rules are international standards, and all banks have these standards that have to be complied with, anti-money laundering rules, anti-terrorism rules, and so on. So at Vista, given our origins, we have tools that are together with our intervention systems and enable us to detect boats, the origin of boats, the origins of the contents of boats. Therefore, today, we can work with bigger banks, and it's because of the level of our compliance and our high-level, compliance that we can interact with big banks. So if the question should arise as to whether Africa is ready for a single regulator, I'm going to say yes, because already within the UEMOA zone, we could have an ECOWAS regulator. And then we have Central Africa, East Africa, and South Africa, because, as he said, we do not all have the same size of the economy. We have South Africa, we have Nigeria, we have Ghana, we have Egypt, and so on. So we can comply. We can have this regulator that is going to enable us move gradually and more deeply. Thank you.
That you would be looking to be harmonized, and how would that support your operations?
Alors, pour Société Générale, vous l'avez dit, on est dans...
The base is to have a minimum of contacts that is required. So it is clear that with regard to standards, we are applying international standards across our countries at local level and otherwise. Now, these standards make it possible for us to consolidate our accounts. The second point is that based on the local and international rules, we are applying the strictest set of rules with regard to financial systems, and because this is what permits us to measure the strength of a bank, and from the point of view of risk and liquidity. So we apply very conservative rules, and we give priority to the strictest possible level of regulation that applies in each country. So this makes it possible to consolidate and harmonize our approach with regard to solvency and so on. So, as he said, it is true that we have to go in steps gradually. And today, this means using the European model. But there's a handicap here because Europe has rules that are already harmonized. Even if the application across different central banks are different, we could adopt the same approach and gradually work towards having an objective approach through a rating agency. This is very important too, because this rating agency should be able to rate central banks, because this will make it possible for central banks to be objective and have the capacity required for the banks that they supervise, so that we will be working gradually towards final harmonization.
And the regulators seem to be in agreement that this is the direction we should go in. So now, DG TAYA, I'd like to come to you. If we were to do this, what would be the regulations that we would start with, and what type of effect would that have on the financial sector as a whole?
Merci donc pour cette question.
Thanks for the question. Very appropriate. I think there's several levels we have to consider at the same time when you're looking at regulation. We have standards relating to own resources, liquidity that's at risk, and which every country is applying. So these are standards that have been accepted and encourage stability. So maybe, but everybody is moving in this direction. Now, with regard to standards relating to money laundering and accounting, with regard to money laundering, at this level, there's a level of harmonization that is being done, because every country is evaluated by GAFI, and on that basis, directives and rules are applied. And every country takes very seriously the rules regarding to money laundering. Our experience in Mauritania had to leave because of the risks relating to conformity or compliance with anti-money laundering rules. Our banks have witnessed a reduction in relationships with corresponding banks because of this issue of compliance, and so we have had to do de-risking, and all this is because of the importance of complying with standards, because it makes everybody have trust, and it also ensures stability. And finally, we have to say that with regard to this, we're looking at investments, and so efforts have to be made concerning capacity building and digitalization, and generally making services effective. So all of these aspects have to be taken into consideration here. Thank you.
Which is centralizing prudential data, how to increase transparency, market discipline, and confidence. So, Dr. Francis, we'd like to ask you your view on this. What would it take to drive centralized prudential data for increased transparency, market discipline, and confidence? Is this something we need more of in Africa?
Thank you. I think so. I think the question is, how do you get to that point? And in data, there are essentially two tensions. One is, because we're seeing it in our own internal markets, the privacy issue. How is that data going to be managed? What are the standards around that? And perhaps this is one area where the EU seems to be leading in terms of how they manage that regulatory framework. So that's one. And the second is, what can we leverage now to move towards more centralized data? And again, if we look at some of the regional groups, certainly I can talk for the Southern African region, SADC, for example. Increasingly, we do have data exchange, we do have more bilateral MOUs. So one building block perhaps would be, could you translate these MOUs into multilateral MOUs and start it as a platform at the regional level? And then you build up. I think in one of the sessions earlier today, there was that question raised, and some of the Pan-African banks are saying, well, internally, we already have this data and we can have visibility on it. But I think we need to have a more formalized structure, and there is sufficient capacity, I think, at the regional level to build up from there. But the key issue, I think, is going to be, one, the privacy issues, and sorry, the other one I should have mentioned is where you keep the data, because that's the other big issue which is now there, because data is the new gold, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Martial, from the financial services perspective and as a representative of a bank, how would you see this would affect your operations, and where would be the pain points, and where do you think that we would need to start in order to move forward?
I think I'm going to come back to the issue of centralization of data by way of answering your question. You see, with regard to central banks, there are banks. That is, we have accounts. We look at the monthly production of data, and it's done on a large scale because within the central banks there's a team that is responsible for that. Now, banks comply with reporting duties, reporting entities within these central banks. So, conformity with compliance is compulsory.
Monsieur TAYA, would you ask a question for me? No?
Did I mess up the order? Please, over to you.
Okay. Okay. À mon avis,
for me, centralization of data is important, but they have to be standardized. So, well, if data has not been standardized, we're going to be asking ourselves what exactly we are making, what we're doing. Well, we have to look at data and policy regarding each central bank. You know, generally, standardizing data has to be, policies have to be transparent. We have to raise the awareness of each stakeholder and work hard towards this transparency. And then it's necessary to have a supervisory organ, an independent one for that matter, that is going to ensure that all of these requirements are effected at the central bank. And the central bank has to have the capacity to supervise other banks. And as Togo said, this perception bias exists, and the only way to fight it is to have clear rules, clear communication about all that is done in central banks, and all these actions should enable a communication framework with regard to financial markets and the central bank itself, and be able to acquire a higher standard internationally. And it is only through these perspectives that African central banks can demonstrate their capacity to comply with international standards and prove that international standards are applied in each of our countries.
Est-ce que l'association des banques centrales peut être l'autorité qui va nous unifier? La réponse c'est oui ou non. Si vous voulez donner des détails, allez-y. Association des banques centrales.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The Association of Central Banks is a supranational organization that that is an authority to harmonize rules. It could be responsible for this aspect, just as well as the banking union of the EU, especially as the Association of Central Banks also has a program for central banks when it has to do with monetary and economic policies. So we're looking here at harmonization of laws and expanding them. And once again, the approach has to be gradual, and it could be different from, because Africa is divided into regions, and that is north, south, east, and west, and central. And I think each region has its economic indicators, and on the basis of these indicators, that the association does what it has to do. So with regard to harmonization of rules and banking principles, thank you.
I guess I can really just add on to that, in that Association of African Central Bank Governors, I mean, that is the program now, is to, or at least that's the objective of the African Monetary Cooperation Program, is eventually to move to a single African central bank. But I think, as has been indicated, this is going to have to be a gradual process. I think the next stages are really about working out the technical aspects of that. I think the other point is, Aristide mentioned in his comments that one of the pillars was strong political support, and when he was talking about the EU. But it's important to remember that the EU has a long history, and where they are now, that political cohesion, if you want to talk about it, came through a lot of things, including wars. So this is a strong vision and a strong journey. It just may not happen in our lifetimes.
Marc, over to you.
Okay. Donc,
I think we all understand that the ideal is to have a convergence, a single African central bank, and I think it's a long road to travel. Therefore, we have to take things gradually. If we want to have harmonized central banks, it's important to have a national independent organ that can supervise and evaluate these banks internationally. If we want strong banks, we must have strong, independent, and credible regulators. It's true. If we want to have strong banks, we have to have strong regulators. Today, what is working? It is a utopia. What we have today is a college of supervisors. So if you're in a country, for example, you ask to be accredited to another country. All these other, everybody knows your dossier. If you're in X country and you want to be accredited to another country, Well, the regulators in each of the countries that you have managed give their opinion. So this organ functions. So I think they had their last meeting somewhere in Accra not too long ago. So I think from this organ, the College of Supervisors who are already doing the work of aligning and recommending can be given a specific schedule that they can work with. Is it going to be done within the framework of an association? Maybe, but already let's take what we have, work with it, work with international banks, meet with banks to see so that we can have the strongest possible level of prudential ratios, financial transparency, because we refer to risks and de-risking this morning here. So when these standards are applied in banks, all the central banks will have to comply. The key subjects such as capital of banks, whether we are in UEMOA, Marc, in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Mauritania, Egypt, Zimbabwe, it's the same thing. So the level of shareholding, share capital determine a lot. So there has to be convergency within a short time, you know, within central banks and maybe with regulators on a longer time.
Questions from the audience, whether on the last point we discussed of an African central bank or on any of the other discussion points. So if you could please, anyone has a question, feel free. This is a safe space. Just say your name and the institution that you represent and which question and which panelist you'd like to ask your question to. Please don't be shy. I think maybe the first row has a couple of questions. Okay. The mic is coming to you. And I do know we also have other central bankers in the room, so maybe they would be encouraged to ask and share.
Good afternoon. My name is Megan, and I represent Visa. So my question is, in the start of the panel, the comment was made, what is the risk of not having a unified banking authority? And then in closing, I think the narrative was, well, maybe not in our lifetime. So between those two disparate messages, my question to, and the panel can decide who best to answer, my question is, what risks do we hold if we delay this? And with those risks in mind, what steps could we take that would gradually move us in that direction?
Thank you very much. So we're very lucky to have regulators on this panel. So I think maybe I can ask Dr. Francis to take that question first.
Thank you very much. So, two things. I think what is positive is that there is strong practical steps which have been taken to push coordination, whether it's through the regional levels at which we're seeing within the regional groups much stronger cooperation. So I can think about cross-border payments area, I can think about the supervisory border payments, I can overlay that with areas like enhancing your standards. We have just done the ISO 222, for example, in the RTGS. These things enable greater collaboration. So there are some important practical steps we can take. I think for me, the message of saying not in our lifetime is to really understand that, you know, there's an old Latin maxim, I think, hasten slowly, that to get to where we want to be is still a big journey, even though we're pushing and there are clear steps we can make to get closer together. And one of them is just the reality of politics for it to all work. So that would be my point.
Thank you very much, Deputy Governor. Deputy Governor TAYA, would you like to add something?
Merci beaucoup. Donc,
Thank you. I wish to remind us of one or 2 points. It is true what was said about a supranational organization is going to be a long-term reality. That's the objective. Now, what is important is that in each country, each central bank, to have a strong and credible supervision to reduce risks and also enforce its credibility before international partners and international partners, so that this private sector of that country can play the role of developing its country as of rights. Honestly, it's in the interest of every central bank, every country, to have strict rules that can be compared to what is happening in other countries.
Merci.
Anyone else in the audience like to ask a question? Okay, the gentleman in the middle row in the back. The mic is coming to you, don't worry.
Merci à tous.
Thank you all.
And my question is, insofar that we were to have a Pan-African regulator, that by definition would mean that any violators of Pan-African regulatory policy would have to be subject to a international or otherwise a Pan-African judiciary board. And so I'm curious and this really is a question for the full panel, but I'm curious for your thought as to whether the establishment perhaps first of a very strong regulatory authority that has jurisdiction across all countries in the continent would also potentially be a bridge through which we might see a much stronger African Union / Pan-African government.
Thank you. That's a very thought-provoking question, and leave it to the techie to ask a very disruptive question. So which of the panelists would like to take this one? Thank you, Marcel. Don't leave me.
Je pense que ça rejoint un peu ce que j'évoquais. Un régulateur panafricain à travers, je dirais, l'Union africaine serait idéal. Mais aujourd'hui, je pense que c'est un long chemin à parcourir. On l'a dit tout à l'heure. Ça nous paraît pas crédible.
It doesn't come across as credible to us. It's a long road to travel. But yes, when we talk about independence, yes, of this regulator, yes. I'm saying that this regulator, I'm going to call this entity supervisor. I think controlling all the central banks looks realistic in the short term, and it will be more coherent too in the short term. That's what. Maybe to complete what he said, when you look at the Basel Committee 1-2, even within the controllers in the Central Bank of West Africa are invited before they can be invited to intervene over certain things. They need powers, and to be able to give directives, you have to have powers. When you look at the Human Banking Committee that is chaired by the governor of the Central Bank, I think each country has a representative. I think there are 2 representatives per state, and they as a union, this body as a union has to have the powers. And if you're an association, you can only make recommendations that can be a dead letter or applied. So since all our regulators today work under Basel 1 and 2, this Association of Central Banks will sooner or later will, you know, we as bankers have to have best practices and align with these best practices, because if we want to mobilize funds, we have to comply with governance principles. We have to comply with IML standards. Otherwise, our central banks are going to end up as a microfinance system. So we need power. You have to have power so that you can apply it.
More. I saw there was 2 questions in the front row, so we'll start with the gentleman on the right.
Thank you for an interesting conversation. I'm wearing my journalist hat at the moment, Ramanyang from Bloomberg. I want to start with where Dr. Francis CHIPIMO left the conversation. And I'm trying to argue this out from the perspective of a politician, right? Politicians respond to incentives. Some of those incentives will be coming from the retail market. Some of them will be coming from within the political system in which they exist. They could say, hang on, has the current system stopped banks from expanding across Africa? Probably it hasn't. You've got UBA, you've got Standard Bank expanding across continent. So from their perspective, the argument would be, if it's not stopped banks from expanding across Africa, and this arrangement doesn't essentially mean that I have to give up control of monetary policy, why do I need to agree to a unified banking authority? Because from their perspective, what's the upside?
Gentlemen.
Since I was mentioned, maybe I should take a first stab. Politics and incentives. You know, in a way, I could kind of relate it to the comment I was going to make on the previous question, which quite rightly you said was very provocative, which is, does sort of a strong regulatory authority push political integration? And it's really like a chicken and egg situation, and I haven't yet figured out which comes first, right? But what I know is that if you look at central banks, and the issue of the credibility of institutions has been raised, credibility invariably is not really about the rules and regulations you set up in an institution. Invariably, it has to be taken, it has to be earned. And that requires a dynamic between, you know, the public, or the governed and the governed, and the governing and the governed. So I think it's important to understand that that dynamic has to play out. And that's what brings in the politics. Those two positions aren't as far apart as they might seem, in the sense in which we are sitting here talking about, in the end, how does finance help drive Africa's growth and so on. That sits upon expanding trading relationships, which were the easiest thing to start with, which have grown and deepened, and which are being pushed. Slowly but surely, politicians are already committing to greater cooperation and, if you like, increased loss of power. The speed at which that happens, I think, is going to be driven by the private sector, where the private sector says, you know what, we need to go, and these are the benefits. And then perhaps the old enterprise won't seem as scary as it might seem. So there is a dynamic which will have to play out. I think that's the way I would answer it.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. DJ TAYA, would you like to come in?
Merci.
Thank you very much. I simply wish to add that we shouldn't forget that central banks are already making enough efforts with regard to regulation, because they know that they have to align with international standards, and and whether we are looking at they playing as regional or continental stakeholders, they are going to comply with international standards. So it is even in the interest of central banks. It is true that there's a political commitment among African politicians, but it's also the responsibility of central banks to concretize these commitments. So after all, there's a minimum, the particulars that have to be taken into consideration and adjust them with time, and which are in the interest of everybody, incidentally, towards building a strong African financial system.
To a tricky question from the journalist in the first row. Now the next question, Mr. Riyad, I know you had a question. Could we have the mic in the first row, please?
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion, which is very interesting. I wanted to say that regional regulators are a fact of life. We have BCAO, we have BOACA, we have other regional institutions like OUATTARA that are operating. So I think through these discussions, we have seen the fact that these are devices that are working well. The idea of having a Pan-African Central Bank should meet demands that are emerging. Fortunately, the question that was asked initially fits into this mold. Africa, our continent, is not, you know, we have economies with different levels of maturity, and we have to take into consideration all of this. What is interesting as a recent development is that there are indigenous regional banks that are springing up just about everywhere in the region. We have banks in, we can find West African banks in North Africa, and vice versa, and other parts of the country. So we have to inspire ourselves from experiences, and so we have to look at the practices in one zone or another. This is a sharing of skills, knowledge. We saw this with Côte d'Ivoire. I like the word that was used. I think we require harmony and convergence. In my humble opinion, the best banks in Africa are those that have adopted, you know, these regional perspective. Time will tell. That will make these perspectives more useful. I'm from North Africa, but I'm very impressed that what is happening in West Africa is a lesson that North Africa can learn. There are a lot of achievements, and I said, from Dakar to Nairobi, it's 10 hours of flight. We are on a vast continent where macroeconomic realities and criteria are different. I trust the continent that when the need will arise for a continental central bank as regulator, it will be done.
AFIS Financial Institutions Group, Upstream and Advisory Regional Manager covering North Africa, Eastern Africa, West Africa, and I think that's it. So, gentlemen, which one of you would like to take this very interesting question?
That's okay. No? No, pas de commentaire.
Your comments. A central bank an African central bank, what's the role of a central bank? Is to manage the currency, manage inflation, the 4 pillars of monetary policy that was set up a long time ago. Is just that. So, and then, of course, there's also the issue of regulation. Yes, it's going to be a very long time before we have an African central bank. You know how many currencies we have in Africa? We have quite a number of them. I think the regulator is to harmonize and converge. Why? Because banks have to converge. You cannot be a Pan-African bank working in Guinea, for example, doing letters of credit with banks that are in Geneva, Germany, and so on, and not have a minimum and not comply with certain rules. You mustn't go beyond the certain levels of reality in your country. It's not possible. So what we need to do is harmonize and adapt the highest standards in each of these matters. So, the point is that if we want to have a consensus central bank, we have to do the same. So, if we want to converge, and we have to take into consideration diversities, political, economic, and so on. These things make it possible for me to say that, well, it's going to be done. The world is in a crisis. We said it this morning, regulators are here. They are now looking at credibility of liquidity in each bank. So things are being put in place. And what I want to say is that the one who can do a lot can also do less. So with regard to the Pan-African Bank, Central Bank, we're doing our best. It's not for our ego, but just to preserve the amount of savings, the amount of money that we have at our disposal.
The cat.
Thank you. My name is Mamadou Koujim Touré, so thank you for the opportunity to engage. I'm an entrepreneur in the fintech space and also former IFC, Hi Riyadh. I would like to discuss like 2 trends that are diverging and which are very interesting in this particular context, right? So you have a sort of, let's say, liquidity/crisis in the banking sector and some form of concentration, right? If you look at what happened in the United States, Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic Bank, etc., let's say collapsing and having Goldman and a few big fishes to buy them and getting even more concentrated. Credit Suisse, right, which was not ever anticipated, also happened. Not later than last month in China, you also had a major liquidity crunch from a big Chinese bank, I think in the real estate bank, who basically couldn't issue, people couldn't withdraw money. So on the other hand, you have a huge decentralization movement with digital asset, digital currencies, self-regulated authorities using smart contracts, and that have grown significantly to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and that was self-regulated. So how do we find some form of common ground with that natural human need to concentrate and centralize versus a technology that evolves, that put more responsibility in the hands of the stakeholders contributing to this finance industry, but with new rules and a technology and AI that actually take some of the rules of the regulatory framework and allow something that is actually very efficient. One last thing, the banking were initially created and expanded for capillarity. right? Which what made the success in the OECD countries and Western world, because you had a bank at every 2 kilometers. It didn't really happen in Africa, right? 300 years of banking in Africa still led to a 20-25% penetration, which mobile operators actually saw the gap, the leverage on technology to effectively reach to the customers. And they do it with much less infrastructure, etc. So as we go toward unifying banking, maybe the banking of tomorrow won't be a bank. And have you really thought about that? And how much do you involve the so-called non-banks who have a lot of the solution into the banking system, but that are not invited on the table for conversation, except at AFIS, of course. Thank you.
Thank you for a very, very, very long but very interesting question. We definitely need another session for that one. I will note to add it to the agenda for AFIS 24. No, but very quickly, we have a couple of minutes. We have 2 minutes left, so which one of you gentlemen would like to tackle this? Dr. Francis.
Écoutez, peut-être moi je vais apporter un début de réponse parce que ça mérite.
Yeah, I'm going to start giving some sort of a reply. I mean, the question has been asked. We have said that the objective of regulators is to protect banks. You have fintech, you have this universe of banking that is regulated by other participants, and this is some sort of a risk. And we look at the mobile money, T-money, and so on. So I agree with you that we have to look for a way of harmonizing things, especially to converge towards something that can satisfy persons who want to regulate themselves. That is why the central banks are very much involved in fintech and others in order to reduce the gap. You refer to mobile money. All of these make it possible to reduce the gap of what made it impossible for there to be controlled by the central bank. So you see regulators and so on regulate fintech, mobile money, and so on. So this is food for thought, not just for banks and for central banks, but it is good for the economy for there not to be too much of a gap.
Time together today is up. And on behalf of IFC, we thank you so much for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful AFIS. Thank you and good day. Could I ask the panelists to have a picture on stage?